Alan, welcome to About Books.
Thank you.
Can you tell me, how important are your Merseyside roots to your writing?
Very important. I grew up here. I was born here in, well, let's call it the 50s, and in Huyton, Barron Park. And although I left to be a student in my late teens and went to live in other places, you know, Liverpool's the kind of place you think about when you're elsewhere. And I first of all lived in London for 7 years. And all the time when you're away from Liverpool, you're thinking, well, where's the river? It must be just around the corner. I know where it is, it's that way. And in London, of course, although there is a river running through the centre, you never quite get to the sea. It's miles and miles away, so you're kind of landlocked a bit. And I moved later for a job to the Midlands, and I live in Birmingham. And you couldn't get further from the sea than Birmingham. It's about the nearest place by the sea is probably Barmouth. It takes ages to get there. So naturally I miss the sea and the docks and the waterfront and all of that. I thought I would come back and live here. All the time I was living in London, most of the time I've been living in Birmingham, I thought I'm bound to go back to Liverpool.
When did you realise you were a writer? And were you encouraged at school?
I guess it's the kind of thing that a lot of kids want to do. I wasn't one of those kids that filled exercise books with stories. I knew somebody who used to write compulsively science fiction stories all the time. I wasn't like that at all.
What were you like? What sort of child were you?
Like everybody in Liverpool, I was into football, you know. I wouldn't stay in and read books or write. I'd be out playing in the street or playing football or going out, the things that teenage kids or young kids do, you know.
What went wrong?
I discovered books, you know, and although I didn't show an early interest in children's books, I think in the teenage years I found reading very helpful, very exciting, and the school I went to, after a while, I did have some encouragement from English teachers. In fact, the school I went to was in Widnes, so like I lived just outside the Liverpool boundary, so near Chilwell, and at the time, that meant that you couldn't go to a Liverpool school, you had to go to a Lancashire school. So the boundary, which was only about like 100 yards away, meant that I was living outside the Liverpool boundary. So whereas my brother went to the Holt on Queen's Drive, I went to a school that was 7 miles the other way in Widnes. And if there's anybody watching that lives in Widnes, it's a lovely place, but you know, it's a completely different culture. I was only 7 miles away, but the accent was completely different. They play rugby league, they do everything different, and for a Liverpool lad, it was quite a culture shock. And we used to have to get a bus, a coach, Lightfoot's coaches, from Huyton to Widnes, and I know that in my brother's class, my brother went to the same school. What's his name? Alan Bleasdale was one of the Huyton lads that went to our school, and I do remember him. He was a bit older than me. I remember him playing for the first team, the first 11 football team. Because of being a rugby school, the football teams were filled up with Huyton lads and some Widnes lads. And I think Bleasdale was a good player. I seem to remember. Who knows who's going to be a writer? You know, I wouldn't have known at that time. I know his English teacher was, I think it was Tommy Williams, who taught me for a while, and I believe he was very inspirational to Alan Bleasdale. But the teacher I had, Doc Bailey, was blind, and I found it very strange that he wasn't born blind. He'd gone to university and he'd done a PhD, but he was teaching in the grammar school, and it was bizarre. You know, he was talking about Milton and Shakespeare and Wordsworth and whatnot, and it seemed as though he had an extra gravity or an extra level of seriousness because he was blind, you know, like Milton, if you like Homer. But I found his classes very interesting. And then I wanted, you know, I was reading everything I could get hold of. And
Can you remember the crossover? Were there particular books that were the turning point? Particular authors?
Well, I at the time, I mean, they've changed the colours now, but Penguin Modern Classics always used to be in grey, kind of light grey, and as a teenager, you'd work your way through those. You know, you'd read Joyce's Dubliners, Portrait of the Artist. I mean, Portrait of the Artist, I've recently reread it, sort of 40, 50 years on, and I remember the effect that had on me as a reader. And of course, you know, that book is all about ambition to be a writer. And it's about growing up in a school and building yourself and being influenced by people and determining to be a writer. Well, I wouldn't claim that I had the sort of determination that James Joyce had, but certainly it had a tremendous effect on me. And I mean, reading stuff like Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, I guess at that age you're open to anything, really. You don't think, well, this is strangely written. You think, oh, how exciting! Why can't we all do this? You know.
Is that how you started writing poetry, or was it short stories, or how did you find your own voice?
I mean, I guess I must have written poetry, but it's all ripped up, and you know, when you're trying to be a writer, there's a lot of incompletion. You know,
you're a good editor of your own work, are you?
That I could tell you something. I could tell you a story about that, because I do work as an editor, and actually, editing your own work is rather difficult. Yeah. I've edited like about 50 books for publication, works of fiction, and I'm a good editor. Yeah. But other people's, it's a different matter when you're editing your own.
Some people say it's impossible, that you can't.
Well, yeah.
Do you describe your early torn up work in that case, or the work that you have not published because you chose not to have it published?
I started trying to write short fiction, short stories.
With what end in sight, in mind? Was it magazine publishing?
Yeah, I mean, as a writer, of course, I'm a reader, and when you're starting, you buy the literary magazines or the magazines, and you read a story there, or you see a poem there or something, and you think, well, I could do that. I'd like to do that. I could imagine my writing being in that magazine. I'd like it to be in that magazine. And there
were a lot of such magazines out as well.
There's a story there about what happened to the literary magazine, the small magazine, which you know, there used to be lots of them. I mean, they still survive on the internet, but there aren't the outlets for short story writers as there were some years ago. But like, for instance, there was a great magazine called London Magazine, which was edited by a poet called Alan Ross. It was an international magazine, photographs, drawings, fantastic work. And I thought I'd like to be in that, And anyway, I did have a couple of stories published in there, and I felt as if I'd started then,
Did you aim them specifically at that magazine and giving them more of the same, or was the magazine completely different each?
Well, an indication would be the magazine, like Graham Swift's first stories were published in that magazine. So I saw Graham Swift's stories published there, and I thought, well, I'd like to do stories like that. Hilary Mantel's stories were published in there, and I thought I'd like to be in there.
Your first novel was Flight Patterns.
Yeah.
What was the difference between writing, crafting short story to working on that?
Very different forms, and there's an argument. I mean, Muriel Spark has advanced this argument, saying that she wrote novels because she didn't have time to make them as short stories. That is, the craft required and the concision and economy and so on, she was saying was actually in some ways more like a poet's craft than a novelist than a novel is. So I worked at trying to work on the craft of doing short stories, which are like 3,000 words or 5,000 words. I did have one story which was set in Liverpool. It's called Ice on the Golf, which is about my father playing golf on the Barron Park golf course in a magazine called Critical Quarterly. That was 9,000 words long. Now that's very long for a short story, but like, I couldn't have continued that to be a novel.
Where did the idea come from? It's set in two different time periods.
Yeah.
1957 and 1991
1990,
to early
yeah.
90s. 30-year difference.
Yeah.
Well, the world had changed.
I mean, my childhood was a kind of remembered 50s. And I had this vague memory, and it was very vague, of something that had happened at a Speak Air show, it was called. What's now John Lennon Airport was Speak Airport. And they, rather like what used to happen, there was the Liverpool show, which took place in Wavertree in the Mystery. But there was an international air show, like the Farnborough air show, and I was aware of this as a kid, but I was very young and I didn't go to it. But what happened there must have stuck in my mind, and I kind of wove a memory of that story around kind of family things and weaved a story around it. The event that took place was that there was this Frenchman who was called Leo Valentin, and the year was actually 1956. I made it 57 because the years in my book added up differently. And I changed the name of the aviator. But what happened, he constructed a set of wings out of balsa wood, and he jumped from a plane over the air show and flew. Something went wrong. I better not spoil the story.
And the book, did you have an agent at that point? How did you go about marketing
I did have an agent.
And were they helpful?
I was a publisher for 14 years. Agents, if you imagine a football manager and you ask them, what do you think of agents? So it's the same thing you ask a publisher, what do you think of agents? It's different for a writer because, of course, the agents, they're good for the writer. My agent was great. She made some suggestions about the first drafts that I sent. And then when it was ready, she said, right, we'll try it out.
It led to the second book.
People say about the first, your first LP, you know, and your difficult second album. Yeah. It's not necessarily difficult for the author, but when your first book comes out, nobody knows who you are, and your book could be great, or it could be disappointing, and but your second one, you're at a disadvantage because they already know what your first one was like. My second book was quite different from my first, and it was a different publisher, and different agent, and everything.
Have you reread it within recent memory?
I reread it last night, actually.
Oh, right.
Yeah, I haven't read it for quite a long time.
And did it come fresh to you? Were you able to distance yourself and read it as a reader?
I was. I didn't recognise it.
Were you impressed?
I mostly was, yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah. No, I was pleased with it.
Do you approach writing in a different way today? That's back in 1999, which is the last century.
Well, it was the last century, and it was very exciting. It's very exciting for a new writer to have a first novel published. I was going to say that, you know, I know from being a publisher that a lot of people write. When their first novel is published, very often they've got 2 or 3 or 4 in a drawer. You know, their first attempts to do a publishable novel. And I'm lucky in that the first one I did was published.
Director of the Tyndall Street Press. What does that involve? What exactly is the Tyndall Street Press?
I was publishing director of Tyndall Street Press, so I was the CEO. I ran the imprint. We published fiction from Birmingham, and we ran from 1998 to 2012. The imprint was sold to Profile Books in 2012, so I'm no longer a publisher. I'm an ex-publisher, but I had a lot of fun, you know, as a publisher.
What are you currently working on?
I'm working on my third novel, which is called Height and Sweet. I have been working on it for quite a while.
Back to your roots, Height?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. They just as in Flight Patterns, where a kind of slice of Merseyside history impacted on a kind of personal story. I discovered some years ago that just up the road from where I was born, there had been an internment camp in 1940, and internees from Germany and Austria were rounded up and interned behind barbed wire on the Woolfall Heath estate, just in the north part of Huyton. And a lot of these internees were very clever people. One of them was the architectural writer Nicholas Pevsner, the economist Klaus Moser. There were musicians, and I was kind of, there were artists. There were art history. Ernst Gombrich was there. I was interested in the musical side, and actually there was a composer there called Hans Gaal, who, while he was in Huyton, composed a piece called Height and Sweet, and it's a short piece of music for flute and 2 violins. And it was played on the Isle of Man because the people in the internment camp were moved on to the Isle of Man, where there were a number of internment camps. And also the members of the Amadeus String Quartet, which is probably the most famous of the post-war British quartets, they met at Huyton and then formed after reunion in the Isle of Man. So like there was a lot of music, a lot of discussion. It was a big mistake during the war that the Home Secretary at the time ordered these harmless people who had escaped Germany or Austria because they were anti-Nazi and Jewish, and they were rounded up and treated like enemies. They were called enemy aliens. And so I've researched that. I went to the Imperial War Museum and to the Isle of Man to research.
You mentioned that you know, as a publisher, having worked as a publisher, you know almost too much now about the innards. Can you put that aside when you come to, for example, to write?
I mean, one of the things that it's a bit like that. The music industry is led by technology, so. Like we don't use typewriters anymore, and you don't. Well, people do read paper manuscripts still, but the whole printing process is so much easier. So it's all very, very quick. So, but the editing is still required. I'm very conscious, having been an editor, that I'm conscious of the work that has to be done before my book is ready to go to the agent. When it's, I'm very aware of what needs doing to it before it's finished.
Are there areas in writing you would like to work in? Theatre, television, movies? Or are you happy as a novelist?
You know, some people are very versatile. I think I realised pretty early that I wasn't going to be a poet, you know, so the best thing to do really is to stop writing poetry. Similarly, I tried to write some radio plays, and I remember getting a rejection slip from the BBC saying, fundamentally undramatic, and I thought, well, right, better leave that, you know, stick to the novels. This current novel has taken so long that the next one is waiting, you know. I'm looking forward to starting that, but you can't start it until you've completed the one you're working on.
Wish you good luck.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Alan.